lesson 5.1, we're talking about estimating sums and differences with fractions and mixed numbers. And so when we look at a fraction, we try to figure out, well, what's the value of it? And so to do so is taking a benchmark of that. Well, and a benchmark, well, that's a convenient number used to determine or to replace fractions that are less than 1. That are less than 1. So if we look at our numerator, or for these examples here, a numerator is very small when it compared to the denominator. So when we look at 1/8, 3/16, 2/25, or 9/100, the numerator is very small compared to what the denominator is, so our benchmark would be 0. Think of it really as rounding. Is it, greater than half? If it's greater than half, it becomes 1. If it's half, it's half. If it's less than, or if it's less than half, it's 0. So for this next section, numerator is about 1/2 of the denominator. 3/8 is really close to 1/2. It's not to say it's less than 1. I mean, it is less than 1/2, but 4/8 would be half. 3/8 is pretty close, so we could say that that's half. Just like 9/16 is close to 8/16, which would be half, so we'll call that half. 11/25, 52 over 100, all of those we'd benchmark at half. And then our next section, the numerator and denominator are close to each other. So 7/8, 14/16, 23/25, 95/100. Well, that's really close to a whole, so we'll just call it 1. So let's take an example. If we take a benchmark for the measurement of 1/24 of a foot, well, 1 is way less. Compared to 24. It is less compared to 24, but it is very much at the bottom end of it, so we choose the benchmark of 0 feet. So our quick check, go ahead and look at 8/9 and compare what benchmark we might use for that. Alright, you should be able to see that 8/9 is very close to 9/9, which 9/9 would be a whole, so we'll use 1 as our answer. Our second examples, estimating each sum or difference, and we'll use the benchmarks of 0, 1/2, and 1. So when we look at 5/6 plus 4/7, well, 5/6, that's really close to 6/6, so we'll say that's 1. And then 4/7, that's really close to, 3.5 is half of 7, so we'll call 4/7 1/2. And then we say 1 plus 1/2, well, that'd be 1 and 1/2. Let's take a look at the second one here. 7/8 minus 1/9. Well, right now, we could look at 7/8 and say, well, 7/8 is close to 1, and 1/9 is at the very bottom end of that fraction. 1 is much less than 9, so we'll call that 0. And so 1 minus 0 is 1. The way that we look at this is we don't have common denominators, and we can't add or subtract fractions without common denominators. So this way we can see, well, is our answer going to be reasonable when we figure it out, finding the actual answer. And our third example here, Stephen is 13 and 11/12 years old. Think of it 12 as our denominator. Well, there's 12 months. Chloe is 9 and 1/4 years old. Estimate how many years older Stephen is than Chloe. Well, 13 and 11/12. Well, we're going to say that that's really close to a whole, 11/12, and that whole that we'll add this 11/12, we'll call that 1. And then that 1 with that 13, well, that's going to be 14. Since 11/12 is greater than 1, we'll round that to whole, and then the whole thing becomes 14. 9 and 1/4, well, 1/4 is much less than half or even the whole thing, so we'll call that 0. And then 0 and the 9, well, that's just going to stay as 9. So then we look at 14 minus 9, and we say, well, she's about 5 years older, or Stephen is about 5 years older than Chloe. All right, here's where you will take a try at this, and we'll check here in a second. All right, so we have 5 6 plus 3 7ths. Well, 5 6, that's really close to a whole, so we'll say that that's a whole. And then 3 7ths, that's right about almost half. 3 1/2 would be half of 7, so we'll call that half. So 1 and 1/2, well, that's 1 1/2. And then we have 12 13ths minus 2 5ths. Well, 12 13ths, that's really close to a whole, so we'll say that's 1, and then 2 25ths. Well, that's really much less than 22 is much less than 25, so we'll say that's 0. So 1 minus 0 is 1. Alright, it takes 3 3/4 hours to drive to the beach. It takes 8 1/2 hours to drive to the mountains. So estimate the difference in driving times. Well, if I have 3 3/4, that I'm going to change to a benchmark of 4, because 3 3/4, 3/4 is really close to a whole. So we take that 1 that the 3/4 becomes, add it to our 3, and we get 4. And then 8 1/2. Well, 8 1/2 is already half. I mean, we can just leave that fraction 1/2. So that stays. So now I look at this and say, well, 8 1/2 minus 4. Remember, I have to line up decimal points when I do this, and I get 4.5. So what is the difference? Well, it's 4.5 hours. That's the end of lesson 5.1.